Thank you for joining. In this lesson, we will complete the repository pattern implementation for the remaining CRUD action methods in the controller of our Planets project. This will help separate the concerns of the database and the controller. Let's open the interface and define all the required methods. You can click on the controller in the Solution Explorer to see a list of the defined methods within it. This list in the Solution Explorer tree represents the action methods we need to implement in the interface. In the interface, we can duplicate the getAllAsync method 4 times and modify it according to the required action method names. These modified methods will be named GetByID Async, Insert Single Async, Update by ID Async, and Delete by ID Async. Since these methods return a single item, we can remove the generic list class. For the time being, we can comment out the definitions of these last 3 methods. The interface definitions are ready. Now we just need to remember that we have all these required methods in the interface, and we need to implement them in the class responsible for the repository pattern, which is SQL Server System Storage Repository. Now, 2 classes require amending. The first one is the controller class, which currently communicates with the database directly, using these 4 action methods. This behavior must be changed, so the controller talks to the repository first. The repository class, which will implement all the methods and required logic from the interface, will communicate directly with the DB context and pass the data back to the caller, which is the controller. As a quick reminder, the getAll method we implemented in the previous lesson routes the data we receive from the DB context to a client, allowing us to work with the data through a clean and consistent API. This approach keeps our data access code organized and decoupled from the rest of our application. We should use the same approach to amend these 4 remaining methods. They should communicate with the repository class first and only then provide a response to the client. If the data flow is still unclear to you, please refer to the previous lesson, where I explained the entire process step by step. The getByID method receives an ID as an argument and, with the current implementation, directly locates the required record within the database using this ID. To decouple this logic and implement the repository pattern, similar to what we achieved with the getAll method in the previous lesson, we need to make a change to this string. We should pass the ID argument to the repository class, and the repository class utilizing this ID must then find the necessary record in the database and return the response, which should be stored in this variable. I will copy this entire string and we will paste it later in the repository class. Now let's modify this variable, since it needs to use the injected SQL Server System Storage Repository class. Then we can access the getByID async method and pass the ID we receive from a client. The rest of the logic in this action method remains unchanged. Now let's switch to the repository class and implement the method. Afterward, I will paste the string we copied earlier from the controller. We will provide a parameter to this method of type GUID, and then we need to return this variable. Also, don't forget to mark the method as async. That's it, the controller and the database are decoupled, and both have an intermediary in between, which is the repository class. This class logic is based on the repository pattern, currently utilizing 2 methods. One more thing, the interface definition needs to be updated with the GUID and ID. Next, in the interface, I will uncomment the 3rd method, Insert Single Async, which will now be implemented. The method's definition needs to be amended, since it now receives an argument. We can provide this argument to avoid further errors. In the controller, these 2 lines of code responsible for saving data in the database will be moved to the repository class. Let's cut it, and instead, we need a variable that will hold the database save data response from the repository class. So we can take advantage of this variable solver system, override it, and assign it to the updated logic, which is the insert single async method. For this method to work correctly, it must receive an argument, and this argument will be the same solar system variable, like this. Now with this logic, the insert single async method has to receive this argument, return a response, and store the response in the variable. In the repository class, as is customary, we implement the insert single async method, mark it as asynchronous, paste the copied part from the controller responsible for saving data to the database, and then add the return statement. Additionally, we need to correct my earlier omission by changing the add method to add async. With that, this method is now completed. Let's move on and uncomment the updateById async method. Similarly, we need to amend its definition by providing the required part as a parameter. The definition is now ready, and we can proceed to implement this method in the repository class. And don't forget to include the async keyword to define this method as asynchronous. Now that the method is ready, we can update it with the required logic. From the controller, simply cut the necessary code and paste it into the repository class. Then add the return statement using the solar system single variable. Make sure the if check returns null. By returning null, we maintain the responsibility for returning HTTP responses in the controller, while the repository is responsible for data access and returning either data or null in case the item is not found. Next, rename the necessary variables to match the parameter name. In the controller class, we will copy the necessary code from the insert single method. We should rename all three variables to solar system single. Also, change the method name to updateById async and update the three DTO references to match the update solar system DTO parameter. Additionally, we need to add the required ID as an argument. Furthermore, in the interface to handle cases where the client might not provide data, we should mark the return type as nullable. This explicitly indicates that the method might not always return a valid solar system object. With these changes, this method is now ready to use. It's completed. The final method will be delete, and as we recall, it takes one required parameter, which is ID. Therefore, we need to include this parameter in the method definition. As is customary, the next step will be to implement the method in the repository class and mark it as async. From the controller, we will copy the necessary code and paste it into the repository class. The if block will return null in case the item was not found, and the method will return the solar system single variable if everything is successful. Now the controller needs to create a request to the repository class method deleteById async and pass the required ID. The database save logic needs to be removed. The rest of the method remains unchanged. With that, the repository pattern is fully implemented within the controller logic, and best practices have been followed. All action methods in the controller now have no knowledge of the database, as concerns have been appropriately separated. If you need to understand the data flow, please refer to the DTO lesson implementation, where I have explained everything in detail. This pattern in general has no difference in implementation when compared to the DTO pattern, as both patterns primarily focus on separating concerns. If you test this code in Swagger, it should work perfectly. In case you have implemented the repository pattern in your code and encounter an error, please refer to this code on GitHub. The link is provided below. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or need further assistance, feel free to comment below. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more great coding content. Stay updated with the latest videos by ringing the notification bell. Happy coding!